Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the natal chart of Elton John. Elton John was born on March 25th, 1947 in England, and he is somebody that I have listened to since I was young. I remember being a kid, and that was probably the first song that I knew from him as a kid. Don't Go Breaking My Heart. And then when I was a teenager, they played a lot of his earlier music and also his kind of comeback period in the early 80s. And recently I saw Rocket Man a few years ago, and I've been on an Elton John kick ever since, but early Elton John. So I also read his autobiography and I enjoyed that. And so just getting more insights into his life. And I was actually quite surprised that he really did struggle so much after he became famous. And I wanted to look at, what could be going on there, or just in general, his personality. When we think of Elton John, we think of the outrageous outfits. I mean, obviously, the amazing talent, but the outrageous outfits, the very witty personality. And, I've seen it in multiple interviews of his from the past, and he just has that. It's not just a likable personality, but he just has a really entertaining persona. And so his inner planets or inner points, his sun is in Aries and his moon is in Taurus. And I was just commenting about the moon in Taurus. I don't know what video it was, but I was noting these famous singers who have the moon in Taurus, and I mentioned Jim Morrison as well as Mick Jagger, and I knew that there was somebody else, and here it is, Elton John. Now, does the moon give you a great voice? Well, I don't think that we can look at the moon specifically for that, but the moon is creative, and Taurus is the sign that is connected to, is ruled by Venus, and therefore has that artistic connection to it. Also, Taurus rules the throat. And so I think when you have a prominent Taurus, that you will tend to have a nice voice. I have Taurus rising. What do you think? So speaking of that, so his sun is in Aries, moon is in Taurus, but speaking of rising signs, his rising sign is Sagittarius. And that is very interesting because Elvis Presley had Sag rising. And I was trying to really get a handle on that. What does that mean? Does it give them charisma? What is it? What I think it means is that the person comes across in a way, because they're ruled by Jupiter, where it's like beyond them. What's that expression? It's bigger than them, because Jupiter is the bigger picture. And so, for instance, with Elvis, it was this idea of, first of all, we could say arguably the first rock idol. Not the first person to do rock and roll, but the first rock idol. And rock and roll had an image in the mid-50s as being this vehicle for rebellion. And that is right up Sag's alley. There's that sense of, valuing freedom over conformity. and whatever, by any means necessary. So with Elton, and this is like 2 decades later in the early 70s, he was transcending that cookie cutter rock star image of having to look a certain way and, that kind of thing. He couldn't be more opposite what had come before him. And I mean, even some of the contemporaries of that era, like Cat Stevens, was a really handsome man. And Elton, I think Elton's cute though, but he kind of broke that mold. And that's what, Sag is about, freedom. So it's about freedom from conformity, having to conform to a certain image as well. And the rising sign is your image. But I just think that there's a larger than life quality, for the persona of a person who has Sag rising. Now, Aries is another sun sign, and fire sign, and that's his sun sign. So obviously, he's got the sun and the rising sign in fire, and yet it's an early degree of Aries, and he does have Pisces represented with his inner points. He has Mercury in Pisces and Mars in Pisces. So he's not going to be as bold as a typical Aries person might be. Aries sun signs can be quite confident, and some people may view it as cocky. And they are very extroverted, outgoing. There was always a quality of Elton John, I think, in those early years that was quite introverted and pensive. And I saw this one picture. They had a slideshow along with one of his earlier songs, and there was just such a look in his eyes. It was so Piscean to me. And with Mercury in Pisces, the person thinks like a Pisces. And that can be very good for creative pursuits, for sure. But in terms of the person's thought patterns, they can be self-defeating. They can be maybe anxious and, helplessness and that kind of thing, which is the antithesis of what Aries represents. Aries is very can-do, very active, very, take charge. So there's these things battling out within himself. But I think that as the person gets older, and certainly now, he seems to have come into his own. And by the way, you might say, well, no, duh, he's like this famous, very wealthy, famous rock star, a legend. Of course he has that kind of confidence in himself. And I'm not talking about that, because even when he was the biggest star around in the mid-70s, he was like going through hell emotionally. So that doesn't always just follow that because you're successful, you're going to be happy and confident. I think it came with his sobriety, actually. And we can talk about that as well. Why would somebody with these placements have an addiction in the first place? And I would say there are a few things going on here. First of all, he's ruled by Jupiter, so there is that tendency towards excess. And even physically, a person, your appearance, your body can be determined by the rising sign. With Jupiter at the ascendant Sag, here, the person may easily put on weight. And he certainly has had issues in that department from time to time. Also, there can be this excess within that person where they just want to just indulge, and, an indulgent personality. And this is exacerbated by having the moon in Taurus. Now, Taurus, the moon is exalted in Taurus, so it's supposed to be very well placed in Taurus. Quite frankly, I'm not sure why necessarily. I have read up on it, and I guess that, Taurus is a stable sign because it's Earth and it's a fixed sign, but I still don't really get why Taurus would be the best place for the moon, because it's not really emotional. And maybe that's a good thing, But anyway, there's a fertility here, and it's also something where the moon can indicate how the person feels when they are emotionally vulnerable, or what they do. And with Taurus, there could be a tendency to shop when the person's emotional. So there's a materialistic part of Taurus. And in the moon position, it's like, oh, I'm going to buy something that's going to make me feel better. And then, of course, the indulgence factor, the sensuality, and that could be excessive sex. And I don't know if I think he was treated for sex addiction too, in addition to his other substance abuse, but don't quote me on that. But there's also like the indulgence of wanting to feel good all the time. Taurus is about the five senses. So anything that can make that person feel good, even if it's chemically induced, they might be drawn to it. Mercury is in Pisces. We talked about that. Venus is in Aquarius. And Venus in Aquarius can make a person... This was interesting because Elton claimed to be bisexual. And he actually married a woman. Was also at one time engaged to a woman, but eventually married somebody in the early 80s. Or mid-80s, I can't remember. But in his marriage house, the 7th house, he has Uranus here, the ruler of Aquarius. So this can indicate unusual relationship setups. I read in an interview recently that his marriage is an open marriage, and I don't know why. I wouldn't be surprised if this is not his desire, even though he has Uranus, and it might be his desire. I don't know if his husband is a lot younger than him, so I just naturally assume that it's his husband wanting that open relationship, but I don't know. And he does have Uranus here. That could be somebody who wants a unconventional marriage arrangement. And Uranus is unconventional, but it's really being led by freedom. So like a polyamory could be one possibility, or just like an open marriage. And it's interesting because a lot of people think that there's something immoral about an open marriage, but it's actually living in integrity, of saying that the person doesn't want to, cheat. They want to be above board about seeing other people. And some people may ask, well, why would somebody even want to get married if they want to, see other people? And, there are different reasons that people choose to get married and keep, and have an open relationship at the same time. But it's a different way. It's like, I think ultimately because he does have Venus in Aquarius, there's a mentality of, hey, I don't own you and you don't own me. So do we have to just kind of police each other and demand that the other person never have any, kind of relationships with somebody else? And if both people agree on that, then that's something that they are choosing for themselves. But I can see here why he has an open relationship based on his Venus placement and the fact that Venus is, or Aquarius's ruler, Uranus, is in that seventh house. Now, one thing I find interesting is that he has Pluto and Saturn in the eighth house. And both of these, the eighth house can be trauma ultimately. And both of these are heavy hitters. Pluto is one of the rulers of the eighth, along with Mars, and can indicate like very dramatic experiences, but there's nothing to back up that in terms of the life story that has been given, not only by Elton in his autobiography, but in another biography that I looked at, and just information that I've already seen. But, it's important to note that the eighth house can be a very secretive place. It's the house of the shadow. So you never know in life if somebody has dealt with something very traumatic and they've never told anybody, they've never been open about it. The eighth house has a direct relationship to sex, and that's a big one that is kept very secretive. But any kind of abuse of power could be representative with these placements here. And that also can indicate why, somebody has a propensity towards substance abuse, excessive sex, sexual orientation issues that, made him marry a woman, although, and claim to be bisexual. That could have been simply due to the times where it was not as acceptable. But it really doesn't explain it, because by the time he did marry a woman in the 80s, it was not taboo for somebody to be openly gay in show business, not by a long shot. Certainly not as it is today, but it wasn't that big of a deal, so I don't think so. So I think that there might have been still some kind of confusion, or maybe a desire to be other than he was. And then when he finally accepted who he was, I think that might have been part of, when he started feeling a lot better and he was able to feel more emotional stability. And I think one of the issues concerning image, or not image, but identity, is borne out by his sun being in opposition to Neptune. That's one of the big things that you will find, is that the person who has a hard angle to Neptune, or even a conjunction, can really not feel like they have a solid self. And other people sense that as well. And I can't remember exactly what he said about wearing all those outrageous costumes, but it was kind of like, hiding within the clothing, within the outrageous costumes, and hiding the real self, maybe. Mars in Pisces, this is one of the, I think, one of the placements that can indicate substance abuse, because Mars is the person's drive and desire. And in Pisces, which is ruled by Neptune and connected to the drugs are connected to Neptune, for instance, and just escapism, oblivion, and spiritual ecstasy. That the person is driven towards that, and if they're feeling uncomfortable emotionally, they can have a tendency to find some kind of way to escape that reality. And some people, it can be through mind-altering substances. For other people, it can be they can channel it positively in artistic self-expression. And that's actually the constructive way to deal with something like this. In his case, he was doing both. So he had, even though he had those tendencies towards self-destructive behavior, he also balanced it out with, creating music that is timeless and that has really emotionally impacted so many people. I think that he's, whether he knows it or not, that he was motivated to be a healer. I think that also is what it's all about. It's interesting. His Mars and his Sun are in the third house, and the third house is the house of communication. And I was just talking to someone, I don't know, probably on YouTube or under a comment on one of my videos about the third house and singing, because I haven't been able to find anything that corroborates with that. But I do think that it should be in that house, anyone who is a singer, because, it is a form of communication and like vocalizations. And he has the Sun here, and it's typically seen as the house of teaching and learning, and Gemini's domain, the media, social media, and things like that. But I would include any kind of communication, including singing. Now, writing can be connected to this house, and Bernie Taupin was the actual lyricist. So that's very interesting, because he didn't, Elton didn't write. He might have written the lyrics to some of his songs, but not the bulk of them. And having his Sun here, and he also has the North Node in Gemini. He actually has it the exact same degree I have it, which is really cool. But I think that he was born to communicate, and so even if he's the composer, he still is communicating through those notes. And I think of Sag as a communicator as well, and he has that as his rising sign. In his fourth house of home and family, he has the moon. I believe that the fourth house is the mother. And he had a very difficult relationship with his mother as well as his father. His father eventually moved out of the house, and he lived with his mother, and she was disrespectful to him and that kind of thing. But he had a grandmother who was very nurturing and encouraging, and so he did have someone in his corner. And the moon in the fourth, to me, is somebody who has a strong psychic connection to the mother, regardless of what kind of relationship he actually had with her. He still can have that tie to her, on an emotional or psychic sense. And that isn't necessarily good, because if the relationship is dysfunctional, the person has a very hard time getting over it. Like it's like having the moon in Cancer, and it's very sensitive, and it's very tied to the past. And I think that he did have a lot of that for a long time, where he was still living in that past where he wasn't getting his emotional needs met, probably. And but in any case, this is also a sign of somebody who can be patriotic. And Elton has stayed in England. He has not moved to the United States. I don't know if he has property here. He probably does, but he doesn't live here full time, as far as I've heard. And I even heard him talking about, where he lived. I think it might have been close to where he grew up, which is wild. Can you imagine being that level of a star? And I'm sure in England, in these towns, they're not that big, so it's like pretty prominent person to be living in, a little village in England. But in any case, I think that's kind of why that might be how he is. He has his North Node in Gemini, like I stated, and it's in the 6th house of work. So that's why I believe his music is him communicating to others. And speaking of others, in his 11th house, which is the house of the collective, he has Jupiter. So that can indicate, touching the masses. In his 10th house of career, he has Chiron. So that's very interesting, because that, to me, Chiron is the wound that needs healing, and the 10th house can be the father, and he did have a father wound. And for him, his father moved out, and then his father remarried, and he noted, I guess the father didn't, make time to spend time with Elton when he was young, but he was very hands-on, I guess, with his second family, and that was the mind effer, I think, for Elton, is that he, could see that his father had it in him to actually be a hands-on father, and yet he didn't do it with Elton, but he did it with this other family. And I think that's not very uncommon. I think that, and I think the reason it occurs is that the adult, the father, or it could be the mother, but the parent is unhappy with their spouse, and so unfortunately the child bears the brunt of that. And then when the parent marries somebody that they really are compatible with, they tend to be more invested in the children too. And of course, the other family, they're looking at that and they're seeing that there is preferential treatment, and it just is a big mess. So I think it was very emotionally, it affected him very much so for many decades before he was able to put it in proper perspective. So anyway, I think I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that you found this interesting. If you would like a private reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.